All right, we are gonna go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone so much for being here. Today we are putting on one of our Knowledge Bites webinars. It is part of the Southern Vermont Economy Project, which I run out of the Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation. And today we are talking about why the census makes sense. Here's our agenda for today. We'll do a little introduction. We'll have Michael talk about response rates specifically in Southern Vermont, but also sort of a wider view. Teresa's going to talk about some adjustments to the census operational, how they're operating and getting those complete counts because of COVID. And then the biggest chunk of today is really hearing from local and regional leadership around why the census is important for them or their organization. And hopefully you can learn a little bit more about what the census is actually used for. And then Teresa will go into some ways to promote the census. So whether it's through your organization or just to your neighbors, and then touch on really how easy it is to complete. And at the end, we can do any questions, comments, and suggestions for how do we, move forward and get to that complete count. So for those of you who don't know about the Southern Vermont Economy Project, this is a project that's funded by the USDA Rural Development, and we put on webinars, small conferences, mini summits, technical assistance, training, to really help advance local economic and community development projects. And you can find out more at that webpage there, brattleborodevelopment.com/SVEP. All right, Michael, over to you. I'm going to stop sharing if you want to share your screen.
Absolutely. I'm going to try anyway. Yep. We'll see how that goes.
You should be able to.
I think I want to do that. Share, that should work.
Yep. And why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself as well?
Sure, yeah. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this webinar. My name's Michael Moser. I am the coordinator for Vermont's Census State Data Center, which is located up at the University of Vermont. I'm also a research specialist there. And I have been working with census colleagues and the Vermont Complete Count Commission to push out the awareness and communication about the 2020 Decennial Census. Obviously, we've had some interesting developments, whatever you want to call it, that have adjusted timelines and adjusted the work that's being done, and we'll get into that more, I'm sure. I'll start by just briefly talking about the 2020 Decennial Census and ACS and how we use some of those data and why they're important for us to get to that complete count. So the Decennial Census is something that's been going on since the late 1700s. Every 10 years, we are, the Constitution tells us that we must count everyone living in the United States. And so that's what we're doing right now, currently in Vermont and across the country. That complete count of all folks living in the country those data are used for a few different purposes, one of them being reapportionment at the federal level. So looking at how much representation every state gets at the federal level. We also use that locally to redistrict our internal state of Vermont districts, political districts. But perhaps more importantly than reapportionment and redistricting is the use of decennial census data and American Community Survey data to help us in the formulation of funding for, federal funding to state programs, state and local programs across the country. So the decennial census data, it's good to think of that as being a sort of our foundation, the basement, the foundation of our data sets that we use intercensally or every year in between the decennial census. And so whether your program or your funding calculations utilize American Community Survey or decennial census data directly, the ACS and the decennial census data are being used together to create those calculations. So, for example, some of these, well, let's see, you've got the screen share. You can see the counting for dollars up there on your screen.
Yep.
Okay. So for example, this is a George Washington University report that's put out just about every year, and it looks at the federal dollars coming back to the states, and it analyzes many, many different federal programs and tries to come up with a number, the amount of federal dollars coming back to the states. And in 2016, the state of Vermont received almost $5 billion, billion in federal funding coming back through programs like housing and urban development, community development block grants, social service programs like SNAP, and poverty assistance measures. And these just sort of provide an examples of some of the, and I'm scrolling down here, some of the federal program dollars that come back to the state of Vermont. And you can see, I'm not sure how well you can see that, but you can see some of the lists of programs that they utilize in this analysis. So essentially what this comes down to, and this is an exceedingly simple calculation, and actually you won't see it here, but if you take Vermont's total population and divide that number by the number of people in the state of Vermont, you end up with somewhere in the vicinity of $4,000 per Vermonter per year coming into the state of Vermont. And so what that means is that for every Vermonter we don't count in this decennial census, we're missing that opportunity to have those $4,000 of program funding come into the state every year. And that is a gross simplification of the data, but so I'll put that caveat out there. So currently, let's see, stop share. The current situation is, let's see if I can get here. Now I'm hoping that you all can see the state of Vermont household response data. Do you all see that up there?
Yep.
Okay, great. So currently, and this wonderful little widget has been put together by the Vermont Center for Geographic Information, which is a state of Vermont agency or unit within the state of Vermont. And they're basically pulling the Census Bureau data for response rates, and this is self-response. And this is up-to-date information. And what we see here is that across the entire state of Vermont, we've got about a 51% response rate. That compares to the US response rate right here of about 60%. And Vermont has been lagging behind overall the nation by about 9 or 10 percentage points for self-response. I obviously would like to point out some of the areas where we're having the greatest challenges in getting that self-response rate closer to at least the state average or the national average, which would be really nice. Obviously there's reasons for why these response rates are lower in different parts of the state. And I would like to just briefly touch on those as well. And I guess if anyone has any questions or comments, I don't know how you want to handle that, Sarah, but I can take them off the cuff or however.
Yeah, I think if anyone has any, burning questions that need to be answered right away, they can chime in, but otherwise, holding, more discussion questions towards the end would be great.
Sure. Okay, so one of the factors that is contributing to a lower self-response rate relates to the census operations and the delay of census operations that we've experienced due to COVID. The Census Bureau, there's two primary factors. The Census Bureau does not deliver census forms or the census postcard with information on how to respond. They do not deliver those to post office boxes. So if your community or part of the country or region or county has a high number of postal addresses that are post office boxes, those forms have not been mailed, they have not been received by those households. And the only way that those households that have post office boxes receive a form or a notification to complete the census is online, and is in person. I'm sorry. So right now, the Census Bureau has just opened up their field operations for parts of the state of Vermont, and census workers are out in the field delivering those forms to the actual housing units that have not received the forms yet. And that hopefully will end up boosting our self-response rate. Another factor is the prevalence of second homes. And I think that's a big one for us to consider in the state of Vermont when we're looking at vacant seasonal homes. Here you can see in the data, Windham County in particular has a very high rate of seasonal homes, and that those seasonal homes are either receiving the forms or at maybe the primary mailing address of the homeowner. They may not be receiving a form at all, and they may not have, and they certainly will have a lower response rate than a currently occupied housing unit, particularly that has a physical mailing address. So these are the two factors that are contributing to some of the lower response rates, and are the factors that we may want to, or we could be as communities addressing directly. So that's most of what I wanted to talk about. I could just briefly go into the operational adjustments due to COVID. There is
Michael, I'm going to have Teresa touch on that.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Then I won't steal that thunder at all. And that's good for me then. If anyone has any questions, or if we're holding those to the end, that's fine as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Teresa.
Thank you, Sarah. There are three parts of the operation that need attention and understanding for this discussion, as my first thing that I wanted to point out. Think of the Census Bureau as changing data into statistics. It's the largest operation and mobilization conducted during peacetime, so it's several years of a process. Before I outline the three operational steps, let me clarify. The focus is on the buildings. Each building is identified in the country, and it has been assigned a 12-digit census code. Each building has a 911 address as well. Everybody knows the 911 address. They don't necessarily relate to a 12-digit census code, but both are used for this process. So step one is March 12th, all the buildings have a U.S. postal mailing physical address. Those are mailed a letter of invitation to self-respond to the census as mandated by the U.S. Constitution. And then the second step starts March 15th. Any remaining buildings have a census employees that go physically to the address. They verify that the building is really there, match it to the 911 address to the 12-digit census ID, and then they leave an invitational packet at the door. Now, this part of the operation is called update leave, UL, and that update the address and leave the packet, that was shut down on March 18th. So only 3 days of effort and it was shut down from the 15th to the 18th. So that left about 61,000 households in Vermont that need this UL. That's about 17.6%. And in the country, it's actually over 6.8 million across the country that need the step completed. So May 4th, thank you to the governor of Vermont. We're one of the only ones that actually were granted approval for the one component of the census operations to continue. And that one component is the UL, the update leave. That started on May 11th. And so it's usually the workers, they don't talk to anyone. They are just updating the address, leaving the packet. They're following all the guidelines that for the federal and state recommendations for COVID-19. And they, ideally, we want people to wait until they have that census ID and use that number. That will save precious time on the next phases of the operation. Now, the third step is still on shutdown. This is the more commonly known step where enumerators go to the buildings that have not responded. This operation is called non-response follow-up, NRFU. Now, the non-response follow-up is actually the part where the enumerators will go to, and they actually have the right to talk to somebody and take in the data. So that is the part that most people are aware of. But I think for the shutdown purposes, that's kind of the key to the whole thing right now. I'm not sure that, well, let's put it this way. The enumerators, they have the authority to actually take the census information from the respondents. But let me point out a couple of really good points here. These workers are protect the respondents' answers according to the laws outlined by the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. Code for conducting the census, including the handling of Title 13 documents. When the Title 13 document example would be the actual respondent answers. So these workers, they ensure the laws are totally complied with and kept anonymous for the people, and they are used only to produce statistics. So the original dates have been for all of these census operations. I just want you to kind of keep in mind, they're basically about 4 months ahead because of COVID-19. They had to be moved. There is a handy dandy little chart. It's on the website, 2020census.gov, operational updates. Some states are still in total shutdown. So all those, you really need to go to that website. That's where the employees, I actually get my updates from there as well. So I think that kind of puts it into a little bit of a, does anybody have a, I mean, that's kind of the fast answer to, you know, I don't want to get too lengthy about it, about all of it.
I think that's great. And I just put a link into the chat that brings you right to the PDF that has
that would be really nice.
Adjustments.
That would be nice, because really all of these have already changed a couple of times, and who knows what they will be, but we're just so thankful that we can at least get the invitation to the people. That is super important. And I just hope that, you know, we're going to make other efforts as well, but I think that'll be it for now. That's a good answer for you.
Great, wonderful. So the next section is to hear from our local and regional leaders on what they use the census for and why it's so important. So first, we're going to hear from our regional planning commissions. We have Jeff and Jonathan. Jeff's going to start off, and Jonathan is going to follow.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Jeff Nugent from the Wyndham Regional Commission in Brattleboro. And Jonathan and I are not going to talk about so much how we use the census data, but how we've been working with the Census Bureau to help make the census data a bit more richer for the local communities here. So we're all familiar with the fact that you can get census data for towns and counties and states. We've been working with the Census Bureau on something called statistical areas, which are basically lines on the map that don't correspond to towns or county boundaries that are used just for census statistical purposes. So 3 of these types of statistical areas, all regional planning commissions in Vermont have been working on to either refine or create our census tracts, which I think a lot of you are familiar with, and then block groups and census designated places, which some of you may not have heard of. Jonathan's going to talk a bit about the census tracts. As far as block groups, a lot of our towns are not really homogeneous in terms of the characteristics of population and housing and things like that. Our area is pretty mountainous. Terrain can oftentimes divide a town into 2 very distinct neighborhoods. So think about a town in like Bennington County, like Dorset. East Dorset Route 7 corridor is a very distinct part of town from Route 30 in Dorset Village. Or in Dover and Wyndham County, West Dover, Route 100 Mount Snow area is very different than East Dover. Westminster, very different than Westminster West. So a block group is a statistical area that's give or take 1,000 people or give or take 500 housing units. So if your town is bigger than that, has more housing units than that, it may be divided into separate neighborhoods based on this block group. So what we've been doing is making sure that these block group boundaries really reflect the actual geographic divisions in those towns. So it's not, no offense to the Census Bureau, not somebody in the New York office just finding a major road on the map and splitting the town up that way. We've been trying to split up Westminster to Westminster West, Dover, West Dover to East Dover, Londonderry, South Londonderry. So that's one statistical area block group, and probably about half to 2/3 of our towns have block groups. So you can get information not just on your town, but on specific parts of the town. The other statistical area is something called a census designated place, or CDP. And you can think of these as unincorporated villages. So we can get census data on incorporated villages like Old Bennington, Manchester Village, Bellows Falls, Saxons River. But everything else, all those other village areas, we can only get that through something called the CDP, or census designated place. So we've either been creating CDPs in our regions or modifying the boundaries to more accurately reflect, say, not just Manchester Village, but Manchester Center, Dorset Village, South Londonderry, Harmonyville, Townsend, Wilmington, those types of places. New this year are 2 CDPs that aren't village-based, but are neighborhood-based, and that's for the Stratton Mountain ski area, both in the town of Winhall and Stratton, in Bennington and Wyndham counties, and the Chimney Hill residential area in Wilmington. So just kind of as a summary, really stress, if you want to really understand your town, not just get some basic characteristics of it, look a little deeper into these census tracts, block groups, and CDPs. And for villages, we're all interested in economic development, community development in our villages, housing, infrastructure issues. So that data for our villages, I think, is going to be really valuable.
Great, thank you, Jeff. Jonathan?
Oh, let's see. I am here to, does this look like what it should look like? Can people see my screen?
Maybe taking a second to pop up here.
Okay. So far, just me, or anybody see a map of Bennington County 2010?
No, do not see it.
Okay. So I am trying to share this. And
There you go.
Okay, we got it?
It's coming. There we go.
Okay. So hello, everybody. My name is Jonathan Cooper, and I work in community and economic development for the Bennington County Regional Commission. And as Jeff said, there's sort of an interesting well, the county boundaries are really what matters a lot in the census for some sort of for jurisdictional purposes. And so when the Stratton Mountain CDP was being considered by the Wyndham Regional Commission, it was something that lay in a town that was within Bennington County, but was in the WRC sort of service area. So Jeff and I were sort of coordinating and talking a little bit about getting some recommendations for CDP boundaries worked out. Something that straddled the line between Stratton and Winhall was something that required sort of coordination between the two regional planning commissions. What I want to talk a little bit about, take a few minutes to talk about these census tracts and to give a sense of why these matter and how these shift over time. What you're looking at is the census tracts coming out of the 2010 census for Bennington County. And you can see there's some groupings there for a large number of towns. We have 5 municipalities, north to south, Dorset, Manchester, Arlington, Shaftesbury, and Pownell, that were their own tracts. And a tract is a pretty broad range for Vermont. It's for population, 1,200 is the minimum, 8,000 is the maximum. That's nationwide, and they really want to have an optimum of around 4,000. So there's a lot of towns in Vermont that are within that range. But in any event, it's usually what the simplest thing that happens with census tracts. They ask sort of local or regional agencies to have a look at what they're proposing for any shifts or changes to the tracts based on that 1,200 to 8,000 population sort of guidelines or spectrum. And the thought is, well, has there been any growth in a town? And usually it's about growth. It's that, oh, there was a subdivision that was developed outside of Austin, Texas 2 years ago. And so now there's about 7,000 people living in this area of the county. And so that might need to become its own sort of tract. But that's not quite the case here in southern Vermont, certainly in southwestern Vermont. We're projected, I think both counties are projected to lose about 4.5% to 5% of their population between 2010 and 2020. That's certainly the case down here. And it's very evenly distributed. We're not looking at just Brattleboro and Bennington emptying out. All throughout the county, certainly with Bennington County, we're seeing 2 to 3% declines in population expected between 2010 and 2020. So for us, it was not about taking the existing puzzle pieces and cutting them up into smaller puzzle pieces. By and large, it was about trying to merge some of those existing pieces together. The first thing we needed to look at was Rupert and Sandgate, for example, in the northwestern corner right here. Those two towns combined had slipped below 1,200. And so the thought was, well, how do we reapportion them in ways that meet statistical integrity, but also maybe could better reflect the ways that life is lived day to day in our towns. One thing to take a peek at quickly is you see here, this tract runs from Sunderland across Glastonbury Mountain all the way down to Stamford, Reedsboro on the Mass border. And while those are all great and noble towns and a proud association, for Sunderland, it does mean that there's a ghost town between the northern end and the southern end. So it was an opportunity, we thought, to maybe recast some of these districts, both for statistical integrity and then also to better reflect the way that life is lived in these areas, particularly where there's shared municipal services and or socioeconomic connections between municipalities. So I can jump over to what we're looking at for 2020 based on some input that we had and then what the Census Bureau wanted to see on its own. A little bit of a change. So we were glad to see that, but we're losing some of those single town tracts. They're, but in a way we're able to buttress that with sort of a larger population. So we'll have a little more statistical integrity and something that I think meets a lot of the way life is lived between towns. We see Dorset and Rupert sort of as a unit, Sunderland, Arlington, and Sandgate, that sort of L shape around Manchester, that is sort of become, there's a senior group called the Sassies for Sunderland, Arlington, and Sandgate. And so it's nice to be able to show that reflected in national level data collection. And so the South Shire basically remains as it was, but a little bit more flexibility in the North Shire, we think, to better reflect the way that life is lived. So when we're looking at the data down the line, the returns, it's nice to know that we'll have some tracks that we feel are really valuable and sort of getting a peek at some areas where there's shared school district activity or where there's some shared employment and workforce sort of draw and attraction. One thing that's interesting that I'd like to point out in closing, the Census Bureau wanted to create 2 tracts in Manchester. So there was an act of subdivision, and it's right along Route 30. You can see that little sort of swoosh running through the northwest eastern corner of Manchester, and that is Route 30. So there'll be a little bit of data sort of separation between the two, and then we'll be able to always collect them or aggregate them at the town level. So there won't be any loss of data for the town of Manchester specifically, but the thought is that the Bureau saw enough activity between the two that they felt that 30 became a bit of a boundary for statistical purposes. So anyways, it's knowing that we're moving backwards in our population for now, we had to do a little bit of merging with our tracks, but we think that we found a way to do it that would make a lot of sense to people sort of with boots on the ground. So thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Jonathan. Next, we have Ruben, who is with United Way of Windham County. So Ruben, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everybody. I am Ruben. I work at United Way of Windham County. I'm the Director of Development and Community Impact. And so I also am not going to talk about how we use the census data, because rather than how what we're doing to help get the counts up. So I think it's going to be said over and over again that the census data is used for federal and state funding. A lot of that funding goes to the populations that we serve that are usually undercounted, vulnerable. So we want to be their voice. We want to be able to tell their stories. As the largest privately funded nonprofit in the United States, the United Ways all across the United States are committed to ensuring that there's a fair and accurate count. We know that there's a lot of miscounting or underreporting, undercounting. And so what we've done is we've created a text to pledge campaign through our 211 platform. Our 211 platform is a resource directory, and 95% of the country can access the 211 platform by just dialing on their phone 211. So this campaign, if you were to text pledge to 211, you can get information on where to find the nearest place that will help you count yourself. So also they can receive information about engaging in complete count programs locally, if there is one locally, and completion locations if they needed that. That's aside from everything else that 211 does. Also, we feel that if census field offices are given less resources, that we can be a resource to help spread the word and get the counts out. With 211, we can identify emerging trends and potential disinformation campaigns to vulnerable populations, which is really a concern as well. That we would have a huge problem with if people are being told wrong information so that they were not counted in rural communities, especially. I think everything else is going to be said again, like why it's important. I think we all know that a lot of our federal $15 trillion upwards is allocated to federal and state funding through the census. So we just want to reiterate our support to helping the full count get met.
Great, thank you so much, Ruben. I appreciate it. And thank you for standing in for Carmen.
Thank you.
Yeah. Next up is Sue Graff. So if you want to introduce yourself and tell us why the census is important.
Sure. I'm Sue Graff. I'm the Agency of Human Services Field Services Director for the Brattleboro and Springfield districts, so all of Windham County and Southern Windsor County. The Agency of Human Services is big. It's 6 departments: Department of Corrections, Department of Aging and Independent Living, Department of Children and Families, Health access, and mental health. So it's a big agency, and the stakes are high in terms of the census. So I will talk about the impact of the census on the funding, particularly for the state and for the agency. So I will date myself by using an old lottery reference from New Jersey. You got to be in it to win it. So it's really important that people get counted, and to echo what Michael said earlier, because it's foundational. So if we're starting from a deficit position, we're already behind the 8 ball. I'm using a lot of metaphors today, sorry. We're already at a deficit. We already are not representing fully our people, our issues, our geography. So understanding that the census, there are 132 programs that rely on census data, federal programs that rely on census data for allocating resources to states, granting resources to states, framing how those resources are available to states. So how we are categorized, whether we're rural, whether we're urban, who makes up our local communities and our state really matter, because when push comes to shove to either apply for a grant or to be allocated resources that are really foundational to how we deliver services in the state, those census numbers, if we're relying on those and we only have the opportunity every 10 years to update them, it has huge impact on how we operationalize and use those federal funds. Sometimes it's a state match, sometimes it's a full federal allocation. So regardless of how the federal money comes to play, it's vital to how we deliver services. So just as an example, I looked at the top 20, again, programs, federal programs that fund using the census track. Number 1 is medical assistance programs. Number 2 is SNAP, which is 3 squares here in Vermont. So the second highest reliance on federal funding is the SNAP program. This pandemic has been a really perfect example of how incredibly important SNAP funding is. You go down a little further, number 6 is school lunch program. Again, we're relying heavily on our school lunch programs and our summer food service programs to feed people, everyone 18 and younger here in the state. Temporary assistance for needy families, TANF, in the state is called Reach Up. Section 8 housing vouchers, on and on. Head Start. So those are just great examples. So that's just in the top 11. I could go on. The WIC program, again, nutritional assistance for women and children. So historically, children 0 to 5 are underrepresented in the census. So just from those few examples, you can see if we underrepresent 0 to 5, we are receiving less Head Start and WIC funding and TANF funding, 3 squares and Reach Up. So 4 really foundational programs in our state that we won't receive as much as we are entitled to, essentially, to support people when they need it. And then I know there are later folks that will speak to this a little more probably later on, but when we don't have the federal funds we need, we're looking at state general funds to supplement or augment that. And the case to be made for that is really challenging in this funding environment and this service environment. So, essentially, it benefits us all if we can have an accurate count and get as high a percentage as possible of folks. Understanding to other points that there's stigma involved in that, there's wariness around the federal government and state government. And so I call on us all to really get creative about how we approach folks around their engagement in the census, make it personal whenever possible to really make the connection between some of those services and programs that folks might be accessing, particularly during the pandemic, that they may not have ever had to access before. It's real for people in a way now that maybe it wasn't before. So I hope that will translate to a higher engagement in the census process. So I want to be creative about really spreading the word and helping people connect the dots. And I think there's some simple ways that we can do that just by checking in with folks and kind of adding that question to some of our routines around have you done the census? And when we hear they haven't, spending a little bit of time helping folks do that in the short term. So that's all I'll say for now.
Thanks, Sue. Next up, we were supposed to have Representative Kornheiser and Representative Gannon sort of representing our state legislature, but they are actually currently on the floor virtually, I would assume. So they will not be able to join us. Next, we'll go on to Haley. She's with Senator Sanders' office.
Hi there. This is Haley Perrell from Senator Sanders' office. I do outreach for Bernie with a special focus on Windham and Bennington counties. And I actually cover a variety of issue areas, not the census per se, but when I was getting ready for the call today, I think that speaks to the idea that the census really touches every single issue area that we cover in Bernie's office and all the issue areas that your organizations cover. And, you know, in my work, certainly competitive grants at the federal level are important to a lot of entities, but a huge majority of federal funding comes through block and formula funding. And again, it is a huge importance to the state. Generally, we like to see small state minimums, which can really benefit Vermont, but when we don't have those, that census data is really key. You know, as we talked about, I think I heard fiscal year 2017, 316 federal spending programs relied on 2010 census data to distribute $1.5 trillion to state and local governments, as well as nonprofits, businesses, and households. That accounts or is equal to 9% of the nation's personal income. So again, it sounds like I'm preaching to the choir, but certainly very, very important. Mostly for funding is what a lot of us think of it for. But also it's important to congressional seats. You know, here in Vermont, we only have one member of the House. I doubt that's going to change for the 2020 census. But that being said, it really is important to accurate representation. Lastly, I would just point to also the uses for demographic data when we're looking for how to guide economic development, workforce considerations, when we're looking at the number of seniors who may be in our areas and the senior housing that might be needed and other services. It really is, you know, a real bedrock to have that data both in funding decisions and various allocations. So I think I'll leave it at that. I think the folks here on the phone know firsthand what the value is and know how it affects your particular work. So really just from the federal delegation perspective, want to do what we can to help get an accurate count. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Haley. I actually just saw that Representative Kornheiser jumped on the call. Not to put you on the spot, Emily, but are you available to share with us? You are muted still.
Hi, yes.
There you go. Thank you for
Sorry
joining us.
Here. And even more apologies for being redundant if someone else already said what I was planning to say because I didn't get a chance to hear it. Hi, Michael. So a few areas where I see the value of a full count being particularly important for my work in the legislature, which I believe is the prompt that I have to speak right now. Great. Sure. One of them is making sure that our districts are properly allocated, meaning that I'm representing a community that makes sense as a community to represent both in terms of numbers and in terms of demographics, and that we're really like doing that mindfully for redistricting. And that is something that Rep. Gannon is particularly passionate about. I'm not sure if he'll make it over here in time. We just wrapped up on the House floor. The other thing that is very meaningful to me in my work is making decisions with good data. I'm on the Government Accountability Committee, the joint committee in between the House and the Senate. And so do a lot of work with my colleagues on data-driven decision-making and how to make sure that the laws that we're passing, we are accountable for and to, and that we're having conversations with the folks who are administering those laws to make sure that they're meeting the original intent. And so when I think about that accountability work, having access to accurate data about our communities, both to develop legislation and to follow up on legislation, is absolutely essential. And the census is always the first place that I go to talk about that data, to understand and to understand what a community's story might be. And without an accurate count, we're not able to do that. So I really see it as an integral part of both passing laws and administering laws that are meaningful and relevant to the communities that we serve. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Next up, we have Bill Anton. He is with the Windham Central Supervisory Union District. Bill?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm the superintendent, one of 4 in Windham County, and basically the census for us is the benchmark for the next decade of money and resources for students. COVID-19 has really highlighted that area because the predominant way that we receive federal grants that flow through to our students are in technology, food, teacher training, after-school programs, and free and reduced lunch. So without an accurate count, without a full count, we're just going to get less resources, and that will create gaps that either have to be filled locally or will not be filled. So just to keep it super simple, it is resources that are baked into the cake of operating a school system. So we need the best and most accurate count because you only get one shot every decade. I will say that we're trying to partner as much as possible to get the word out. Somebody that was very creative, I don't know if they're on this call, contacted me, and we are now passing out flyers with every meal that we give to all of our families. So whoever that was, good job. We're here to help because we know that it is a big deal for our students. So thank you very much for all the work that you guys are doing.
Thanks so much, Bill. Next up is John O'Keefe, the town manager of Manchester, Vermont.
Hi, Sarah, thanks. Sarah asked me to just talk quickly about what the census means for local communities. So I just broke it down into 4 quick categories: funding, planning, perception, and political. The first one is pretty obvious: funding. A lot of the programs that we get money, especially from the state government through the federal government, are based on the demographics of the community, especially things like community development block grants and other programs like that. So an accurate count from that perspective is really important. Of course, also not just the count, but also the data that comes along with the count. Perception for our local community is important. We are the 3rd largest town in southern Vermont, and we're pretty comfortable with that. We're not going to pass Brattleboro or Bennington, so if you're from one of those communities, we're not breathing down your neck, that's for sure. We've got 4,391 people last time we counted. But being the 3rd largest, that's kind of where we want to be. So as far as a count perspective, there are other communities that are kind of creeping up. In the last census, we actually didn't lose any population. We actually gained a little bit. And then there is a community in Lamoille County that starts with an S that we consider one of our rivals for economic development purposes. And in the last census, we passed them by a few folks, a couple people. So that was sort of a running joke at the select board meeting that we'd say, when we talked about population, we'd say, well, you know, we're larger than Stowe. And it's sort of a running thing. But, you know, from the perception standpoint, you want to make sure that your community is growing, maybe not exponentially, but you want to make sure that you're heading in the right direction. I think for the outside world, that's really important. And then, of course, Haley touched on this a little bit, but, you know, you could call it political power, political representation. It does seem very unlikely that we'll pick up that coveted 2nd congressman. In fact, I would mortgage my house on it. But at the same time, you know, there is a running perception in southern Vermont that the northern part of the state runs the affairs of Vermont, and part of that is based on the representation that we have in Montpelier. So as far as making sure that the counts are correct in southern Vermont, I think that's really important to make sure that we have as many representatives in the House and Senate as possible. So that's sort of the political side of things. And then the last one, you know, a lot of our partners here from BCRC are on the call, and we use the census information quite a bit. We did an economic development study with Dorset a few years back that relied heavily on census data. And then we're doing a housing study right now that relies heavily on demographic data. So all that information that we're collecting through the census is really important. And then, of course, we also use all the information in the census to attract new businesses. We're always on the hunt for new businesses. And one of our selling points here is that we do have an older population, but it's a very educated population. The percentage of people who graduated with graduate degrees is higher here than the rest of the state average or the country's average. So we're always digging into the data to try to figure out, you know, how do we sell our community to the outside world. And so I think those are the big reasons that I think from a community standpoint, you want to make sure you have an accurate count. And you know, I can't emphasize enough that when the story comes out about population decline, you want to do everything you can to make sure that when they're talking about population decline in different towns, that you want to make sure that you're in the 2nd paragraph that talks about the couple towns or the other towns that didn't see a decrease in population, that either remained flat or actually increased. And so I think that from that perspective of how the rest of the world views your community, is it growing or dying? It's impossible to stay. It's impossible for a system to stay exactly the same 10 years apart. So you're either going to be losing people or gaining people, either dying or growing. And I think that's really important.
Great. Thank you so much, John. And last but not least, Jason, who is with the Vermont Complete Count Committee.
Hello, everyone. I will make my comments brief because I think Sarah has a little bit to wrap up before we finish. I'd like to start off by saying thank you to everyone in the work that they're doing to participate in helping us have a complete and accurate count. As chair of the Vermont Complete Count Committee, the role of the state's complete count is to make sure that we specifically are targeting the hard to count population, which would be young children, highly mobile people, undocumented immigrants, persons of color, LGBTQIA, persons with mental and physical disabilities, and people who don't have traditional housing, in addition to the indigenous. I think the efforts that I can say for our committee is we are there to kind of help find out where the gaps are at and then transition into what actions we can actually utilize. The committee has a lot of active members and partners, and I think that we are definitely pulling off a hat trick during this specific time. It's been quite amazing to see the work that has been done prior to COVID-19. We were in a very, very different place. And I think we were gingerly and leisurely doing some unique things, saying, oh, we'll probably get it increased. To see it now above 50% in the last couple of weeks is quite amazing, because when this started, it was at 39. And we moved into a lot of social media campaigns with our partners to do a variety of things. I will say that we sent out an email update to the entire Vermont legislature. The governor is being proactive with that and definitely is able to assist in promoting the census to Vermonters and its importance. One of I think our biggest items that we are navigating very, very well is looking at the 4 hards, as I call it, which is the hard to locate, the hard to contact, the hard to persuade, and the hard to interview. Those are going to be our challenges in trying to assist people in participating in the census. From my perspective, since I run the Department of Libraries, if you didn't know, you have a state librarian, which I'm also. One of the things about that is looking at the census data. And to our congressional delegation, I say thank you. The CARES Act, as you know, came out. Within that, our federal appropriator, the Institute of Museum Library Services, gets a little bit of that money to help the library, Department of Libraries help the libraries of Vermont. If you did not know this, Vermont has the highest per capita amount of public libraries in the country. We have 196, 200 during the summer, 4 closed during the winter. So that should tell you they're kind of hard to get to. But I've traveled to over 125. I'm not in the 251 club, but I'm going to make my own library way with that. But to say that very quickly is when they had to decide the amount of money from the CARES Act that we'd receive to disperse to those libraries, they used 2010 census figures. Vermont got $56,834. I think I crawled under my desk to decide how we were going to divvy that up between 196 libraries. But it is something that we're looking at, and I think that we will be very successful. So it just shows you an example of how important it is to have an accurate and complete count, particularly during times such as this. You want to be able to make sure that you are obtaining the federal money that you are supposed to get per your specific numbers. So that, again, is what we do, and we're going to try to make that happen. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Jason. I really appreciate it. All right, just being mindful of our time, we'll just sort of touch on the last few things here. Teresa, if you don't mind covering just very quickly where people can find material for outreach. I have the link here, but if you just want to touch on the types of material, as well as just real brief how easy it is to actually complete the census for individuals.
Oh, she's
you're
muted.
Muted.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes. We have a very wonderful website. There it is. It's 2020census.gov/partners. The outreach materials are plentiful. Please give me a call. I work in both counties, Bennington through Brattleboro. I mean, I've even just done some things up into Orange County. So please reach out to me, and there are plenty of ideas that are working out there. And that website, you can go on there. It's open to the public. You can actually have things, download them yourself, print them out, give them to your audience. Get a couple of people together and create a list of a few groups that you want to contact. I mean, it's so plentiful and so far of a reach to get to everybody. And I think we're doing our best effort, but you be the trusted voice. That's the key. We want you to reach out to your neighbors and constituents and be the trusted voice. That's really important. The easiness of the census, it's safe, it's easy, it's important. We want to count everyone once, only once, and in the right place. And we've had different challenges that are out there that are kind of giving, like one town trying to challenge another town to get their response rate up there. There's been some really fun things that have been done. And there's no time here to go into all those details, but the ease of the census, it's only a few questions this time around. I have people call me up and say, oh my gosh, it only took me 4 minutes. Oh my gosh, it took me 8 minutes. I can't believe it. It's so really, it's how fast can you type? There's only a few questions. Go online. Ask your people if they're not familiar with the internet. Reach out to your friends and family and help them get that, because that's going to save time and money. Use your census ID code. It's really going to help us in the long run. But if you've already responded without that census ID code, please don't respond again. We do have a team in the backside that'll match up those 911 address and the census ID code. But really be the trusted voice and reach out and try to be proactive in helping us along. That's really the key.
Great, thank you so much. Really appreciate you being here with us. Again, just being mindful of people's time. Are there any questions or comments from people who are on this call? David, I know you're kind of in charge. You're still muted there. If you want to just say a few words, that would be great. There you go. Oh, yeah, hold on, you had it. There you go.
Thank you so much. Hi, Teresa. So yeah, I've been working, as I mentioned in the chat, I'm in Windham County for a while. I definitely think that a broad spectrum approach to reaching out to people is important. Some people aren't on social media. Some people need bulletin board materials. Other people need people to talk to them in some way, shape, or form. And so if people have ideas, feel free to reach out to myself or Teresa about other ways to reach these communities that Jason mentioned. We are working with the Vermont Food Bank to get involved in the food distribution programs that are going around in the state. I just posted a link to a huge gallery of approved graphics that can be used for census promotion on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. There's, my number and contact information is posted for Windham County or anyone who wants to check in and get some resources. I also have instructions for people who are second homeowners. It's a strange process for people who have seasonal homes to log their home even though they don't live in it, but logging it counts it, and that's part of the reason why places like Dover have a 5.6 response rate, is because obviously a huge portion of the homes that we counted there are seasonal, and the people who may or may not have been there on April 1st were probably not the owners. So thank you all for the time. I really appreciate the opportunity, and look forward to hearing from you all as we move toward a more complete count than we have now. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Madison, I'm so sorry. I was, my second screen died, and so I was looking at an old agenda, and at that point your name wasn't on it. So if you want to touch Madison's with Shire's housing in Bennington County, if you just want to touch, share some comments about what you guys use the census for.
Sure, thanks. And yeah, I had a ton of technical difficulties, so cut in here and cut in a couple of times, but hopefully I don't duplicate too much what other people said. I think it's pretty redundant because it's so omnipresent and important to have a full count. I'm the communication specialist and development assistant for Shire's Housing. In Windham County, our counterpart is the Windham and Windsor Housing Trust, just for your reference. And we rely on the census both for funding and for planning. It really drives what we do. We're able to leverage federal funds that come, from HOME, CDBG, LIHTC, the low income housing tax credits. We're able to leverage those with other funds based on population distribution. We also, something that kept coming to my mind as I was hearing others talk is that housing is what we're being asked for. All the select boards are talking about how to create housing to house the workforce, to increase the population, to drive economic development. And we can't create housing if we don't have the numbers to show that we have demand. We can't really develop unless we have that. The other thing that I heard someone say was the vouchers, Section 8 vouchers. We're not a voucher distributor, but we do have a lot of tenants who use those, and that is such a huge resource for folks, especially right now. And the other note that I had really been thinking of is that renters are one of those hard to reach populations because they move more frequently, they're more transient. And it's just so important that we're all involved in getting a full count. So we are putting in information into our newsletters. We're actively telling people when they come for food distributions or to pay their rent, we're asking them to take the census because it is so easy. So that's all I've got.
Great, thank you so much, Madison. All right, let's wrap this up. Thank you all so much for joining today. Again, this is being recorded, so it will be posted on the brattleborodevelopment.com webpage. I just wanted to note some upcoming trainings that my project is putting on. We're doing a project development series. Again, that information is on our website, so definitely be sure to register for those if you are interested. And I think that is it. So thank you again. I really appreciate everyone joining who shared with us today, and please get out and enjoy the sunshine, and we'll see you all soon, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Sarah.